We've got hundreds of millions of people throughout the world claiming to have experienced divine healing.
We just have to be open to the possibility that there could be something, we just don't know what's going on there. And so that unknown is, always going to be present, and that's okay. Just to say, I don't know.
If you've pre-concluded there's no God, then you've already pre-concluded. I could show you cases of arms growing back, theoretically speaking, and you would not believe it. You would come up with natural explanations.
Hello and welcome to today's edition of the show. Really exciting discussion for you on evidence for miracle healing. But if you're new to the show, please do make sure to like today's video and subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. You can also find our regular podcast and our newsletter with the links with today's show. Today we're asking, send proof. Is there evidence for modern miracles? A new video documentary, Send Proof, investigates the medical evidence for modern miracle claims. Director Elijah Stephens joins me to talk about what he discovered and why he's asking for more people to submit their stories and medical evidence for miracle healing. But what would it take to make an atheist like Michael Shermer believe a supernatural healing has taken place? Michael, who's editor of Skeptic magazine, and he's interviewed along with other skeptics, healers and theologians for the film. Craig Keener is one of them. His 2-volume book on miracles was a benchmark contribution to research on miracle claims. He'll be explaining why he thinks there is enough evidence for a reasonable person to believe in miracles. So that's our subject today. Is there reliable evidence for modern miracle healings, or is the proof that's been sent in simply lacking at this point? We're going to talk this through with my 3 guests on the show. First of all, the director Elijah Stephens joins us. Elijah, thank you very much for this and for the documentary. Tell us a little bit of your background, what led you to want to make this particular documentary film?
Miracles have been a part of my life, at least claims of miracles, since I was a young child. There are people in my life who gave money to ministers that I thought were cons. There were, I wondered if God was real. I don't want to give away too much from the movie. I served in a church for a while, and a very close friend of mine left the faith, said there's no God, there's no miracles. And I wanted to see if there was something like that, if there was good evidence to believe. And I wanted Christians to actually, the name of the movie is Send Proof, is that if you believe in miracles, to actually send in evidence and let these things be researched and become case studies, because I think you learn a lot about reality one way or the other. And so that's kind of the call of the movie, and hopefully becomes a movement.
Craig and Michael both feature, and you've been trying to look at both perspectives on this. This isn't just a movie detailing the Christian perspective on this, is it?
Right. And I wanted healthy people in it that I thought they come across as, learned and wise, and not to put, the fringe people from both sides. I wanted to have a good conversation, and I hope it sparks good conversation, and people follow the truth wherever it leads and critically think. And I wanted to highlight issues. I think, each voice, we're all humans thrown into this life, and we have hard questions to ask, and each voice adds to that conversation a piece you're not going to see from your own worldview. And so it's very great to have both of them on.
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Michael and Craig on the show in just a moment. Why don't we take just a moment, though, to hear and watch a little bit of the promo for Send Proof.
There are hundreds of millions of people who claim to have experienced divine healing. Are you going to dismiss all of that?
The doctor said, there is nothing we can do. You're blind, and you're going to be blind for the rest of your life.
So you spent 13 years blind. Tell me about the night when everything changed.
There you go. That's the promo for Send Proof. And by the way, it's Send sinproof.com if you want to see the documentary. I understand, Elijah, that some people have been mishearing that as sin-proof, which, I guess don't confuse it with whatever documentary sin-proof is. You're looking for send-proof. But let's talk to Michael now. Michael Shermer has been a guest several times on Unbelievable over the years, quite frequently on these kinds of issues around supernatural claims and so on. Michael, you were part of this documentary. It's not always a good experience when skeptics go on Christian documentaries. Sometimes they feel like they've been hoodwinked a bit afterwards, but you've been good enough to come on this show to talk about it, so I assume it wasn't too bad an experience. What was your response to the documentary once you were able to watch it?
I didn't feel hoodwinked at all. I thought it was a beautiful documentary and well produced, artfully constructed and presented, and I didn't feel like I was misrepresented at all. I think that's all fine. The larger problem you're dealing with here is defining the subject that you want to study, in this case, miracles. What do you mean by a miracle? And, depending on the answer I get here from Craig or Elijah, then I guess we could go from there. But that seems to me the crux of the problem. Once you've defined it in some operational definition way, something that we can measure, quantify, test, if we can do that, then it's kind of in the realm of science, probably. But if not, then it's not really in the realm of science. It's kind of in the realm of religion, and I recognize religious truths as being slightly different than scientific truths, or actually quite a bit different, in the sense that, people may hold certain beliefs that they treat as true, but they're more mythically true or religiously true. Just part of our dogma. This is what we believe. We're Catholic or we're Protestant or we're Hindu or whatever. This is, what we believe. This is our truth. And in a sense, if it's not an empirical claim, if somebody says, I just accept this because it's mythically true for my religion, I'm not claiming I can prove it. Well, then that would be a different realm, if you see what I'm saying.
But in this documentary, I suppose the whole point is that Elijah is striving for some kind of empirical proof.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
Ultimately, do you think it passes muster? Have you ever seen anything that looks close to perhaps providing some kind of empirical proof for supernatural healing?
I watched the film, but I didn't have time to fact check the different claims in there, which would take quite a bit of work. Mm-hmm. The doctor holds up the X-ray. What X-ray was that? When was that shot? Before or after? What was the follow-up on this particular story? 6 months later, a year later? I don't know. You hear these kinds of miracle claims all the time. You can read them everywhere, and many of them, you guys would all reject. If I rattle off the miracle healings of Satya Sai Baba in India. You guys would all go, oh, come on, this guy's doing magic tricks. He's palming the ashes, he's doing this, he's doing that, the kind of things that Penn and Teller do as entertainment. And most Christians reject the miracles of other religions. So there is a process going on in everybody's mind where most of you are skeptical, like me, of most of the claims you hear. So what Elijah's after there is, well, here's a handful of ones that we just can't explain. They don't fall into the realm of obvious con artist or magician, and yet the medical doctors say, well, we don't have an explanation for it. Okay, so does mystery equal magic or miracle? So that's a core question that a scientist would ask. Because medicine's not a perfect science, and lots of things happen inside the body that nobody understands. We just have no idea why this guy got better and that person didn't. Cancers go into remission. Why? Well, I don't know. Nobody knows. Sometimes they do. Sometimes we can pinpoint it. It was because of this treatment or whatever, but sometimes we can't. And what do you do with that? That's the problem.
And I'm sure, in a way, so much will depend on the assumptions, the worldview that someone brings to the same evidence potentially. And Craig Keener, let's introduce you at this point. You have become one of the go-to people in the world, really, when it comes to research for miracle claims. You wrote that massive 2-volume miracle book on both on New Testament model miracle claims and modern miracle claims. If people want to search through the unbelievable archives, they'll find a show from several years ago, which we did for that at the time. But tell us what your response is to this new documentary from Elijah. You're in it. You've obviously watched it. Is it kind of consonant with what you've been trying to do in your research on miracles?
I think it takes it beyond what I'm able to do. I'm not a medical doctor, so I've been able to use the research methods that are research methods in my own discipline, historiographic research methods, and so on. But for scientific evidence, I think what Global Medical Research Institute is doing is really important, and so sending the proof is really important. But again, as Michael pointed out, there's the issue of defining miracles, and there's the issue of establishing what level of evidence will be sufficient for what you're talking about. So, if it's part of your experience, or part of your evidence that you've already looked at, that there's plenty of evidence for what we call miracles, then you're going to be more open to new ones, and your level of expectation will be correspondingly a bit lower than if this is like completely out of our experience. Nobody ever experiences these things. I wouldn't say, for example, that something has to be medically unique to be a miracle, because if God did something twice, well, then you'd say, well, it's not medically unique. Look, it happened twice. And I just bring that one up because there was a case where a girl, I think she was 9 years old, she was praying for healing. She'd just been tested. She had auditory nerve damage. She was deaf without her hearing aid. And she was healed. And it was an instant healing. And the audiologist said, I have no explanation for this. But one of the responses to that, and this wasn't from Michael, but from somebody else, one of the responses to that was, well, look, we've got 6 other cases of this in the archives of world medicine where auditory nerve damage disappeared. But I think the conjunction with prayer, the fact that it's so rare, and that we don't have an explanation for how it works. We also don't know the contexts of those others, because medical documentation usually doesn't mention, the context of prayer or something like that. We have different criteria of evidence used in different disciplines, but in historiography, law, journalism, sociology, anthropology, and so on, one of those criteria is eyewitness evidence. And there was a Pew Forum survey in 2006 that suggests that we've got hundreds of millions of people throughout the world claiming to have experienced divine healing. Now, again, as Michael pointed out, none of us would say all those are really healing. But to me, what it does, it means that we can't start with Hume's premise of uniform human experience to say, human experiences. I mean, personally, I don't think even Hume would start with our premise today and say, okay, well, since uniform human experience is against this, we're not going to accept miracle claims. We're not going to trust miracle claims. We're going to put the bar of evidence so high. And in a number of those cases, maybe not in hundreds of millions, but at least in millions of cases, these were people who started with very different presuppositions, and sometimes were willing to abandon centuries of ancestral beliefs to become Christians because of what they experienced. There was another survey that was done where over half of physicians claimed to have witnessed things that they believed were miracles. So all that to say, I think that there are epistemological questions, and I think that there are other lines of evidence besides this, but you would think, and you'd have the right to think, that if you've got all these claims, at least sometimes you're going to be able to work through and get before and after medical records. And again, that's something that's beyond my, I've gotten them sometimes from other people, but I'm not a doctor. So I'm really grateful for what GMRI is doing, and very grateful for Elijah trying to get more people to send in evidence.
So briefly explain what Craig's talking about there, GMRI. That's the institute where you're encouraging people to send in documentary evidence. And maybe talk about a couple of the cases that are particularly focused on in the documentary. I'm thinking of Bruce Van Natter, who had his intestines crushed, and you can explain what happened there and the circumstances of his healing. And then another extraordinary story related to that later on in the documentary. But yeah, first of all, tell us first of all about this institute.
So they study prayer done in Jesus' name, and so they'll take someone who says, I have had a miracle, and first of all, they'll gather their medical records, and this is where science, I think, can speak to miracles. Was the person sick in the first place? Is the person cured now? What does the medical literature have to say? And then they take it and they go, well, this is extraordinary. Let's publish this. And so I do think there's a voice for the scientific community that the church finds quite valuable in almost, both Protestant and Catholics do the same thing. And so they found several cases. One was Bruce Vanetta. He had a semi fall on him. They removed most of his intestines. After prayer, he reports it growing back. Chris Gunderson was born with a paralyzed stomach. And I can't remember the name right now. It's escaping me. It's in the documentary.
The chronic pseudo-obstruction syndrome.
That's exactly it. And so he gets prayer and is instantly able to eat. And when I'm talking to the researchers at GMRI, they say, "Look, Mayo Clinic says." This does not repair itself. And so I think those are great cases. I also agree that this is a greater epistemological issue. If you believe in God or not, opens up the probability or not, you can even allow for miracles. If you think the resurrection happened, that's going to shift your worldview. But if you're inside the Christian worldview and there's nothing like this, there are none of these events, you go, well, maybe modern miracles don't occur. And if you are inside, you go, well, maybe this makes other conversations more probable. What about the resurrection? Stuff like that. And so I think it's helpful in the dialogue. It's not an ace of spades, if that makes sense.
And you've obviously covered those two examples very briefly there, but obviously in much more depth in the documentary, and they are quite remarkable in the extraordinary change that is there in both cases. So the ability to digest and have essentially normal eating habits and so on, where there was absolutely no opportunity for that before. Doctors say they are astonished. Now, not all doctors will necessarily use the word miracle, but certainly saying this is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like this, and so on. So, Michael, where do you go? And I fully accept that you have not had the opportunity to review or do any research on these particular cases here, but you've seen the same documentary that the three of us have seen. So, what would be your overall response to the questions you'd be asking about those quite extraordinary kind of apparent miraculous healings that have been tested and so on?
Yeah, well, obviously, looking at the medical charts in detail and actually interviewing the doctors, is that really what they said? Is that really what they think? It was truly a miracle? And then we got to pull back a little bit and ask, well, what are we talking about with a miracle? It can't just be, 1,000,000 to 1 odds, some statistical improbability, because those things happen all the time with the law of large numbers. You have millions of people doing millions of things, well, billions of people doing millions of things every day. Just highly unusual things are going to happen all the time, and they do. And these are coincidences, and and so forth. And most religious believers, that's not what they mean. I mean, that would be in the, as I joke in one of my lectures, when Al Michaels proclaims, "Do you believe in miracles?" when the U.S. hockey team beat the Russian hockey team, the idea being really, really improbable, so we'll call it a miracle. I don't think that's what Christians mean. They mean, by miracle, divine intervention. Something highly unusual happened, yes, but it happened for a reason, because God intervened due to prayer or whatever, and that's what makes it a miracle. And I think there then we can ask, okay, well, if by definition you mean it's a one-off event, not just highly unusual, but it wouldn't have happened without divine intervention, and therefore it's a one-off event, well, science is going to have a hard time getting at that, because by definition you're saying it's not repeatable. So like, I'll give you an example. Maybe a decade ago or so, the Templeton Foundation funded a Harvard Medical School study on prayer and recovery from, I think it was cardiovascular illnesses in the hospital. And, one group of patients had their families and professional religious people pray for them. A second group, had just, positive thoughts sent to them, and a third group had no prayer at all. So it was an attempt to, and they actually tried to quantify it, like quantified by, how many days it took to recover. What percentage recovered completely, or 80% or 50% or whatever, and so forth. They were trying to test the hypothesis that intercessory prayer works. And they got null results. There was no difference between the groups. And so they concluded, well, I guess, at least under these conditions, prayer doesn't work. And, that's an admirable attempt to test the hypothesis. But again, if you mean something different, that it's a kind of a religious truth, that would, like the resurrection. Also, I'll tell you a funny story. I was at a conference with Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller and a few other scientists on science and religion. And so, as you know, Richard is Dawkins is a pretty staunch atheist. And Ken Miller, I don't know if you know Ken, but he's a world-class biologist. He was kind of the pioneer of debunking intelligent design creationism, because he studies the kinds of cellular structures that intelligent design theorists were interested in. Anyway, and he wrote a whole book about this. And the last chapter of the book, he talks about how he's a Catholic and he accepts Jesus as his savior and so on. Anyway, so at this conference, Richard's saying, okay, let's say we found a piece of the true cross, the piece of the wood from the true cross. And on that piece of wood was a little bit of flesh left over from Jesus. And we were able to extract the DNA from the flesh of Jesus. And, he's born of a virgin, so he's got to have a different kind of DNA. And, what he's driving at is there some way we can empirically test this religious claim? And before he even got there, Ken says, Richard, I'm not claiming any of this is true. In an empirical, scientific sense, I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. That's my truth. And I'm not trying to say I can prove it. It's just what I believe. And I thought that was really, it was honest. It was, I thought it was thoughtful. It was kind of, I think, a recognition of a kind of truth.
Okay. Well, I'd be interested in response to some of that, Craig. Particularly, I think the first issue Michael raises there, which is ultimately unusual events are not evidence of miracles. With large numbers, 1,000,000-to-1 things happen all the time, he says. Secondly, when you have got something like double-blind experiments which have been shown that there doesn't appear to be any effect, interested in your comment on that, and who knows, maybe the story of Dawkins and Miller as well. But what's your view on both of those sort of objections, really, to the scientific claim that miracles can be tested for in that sense?
I think Michael's right about, obviously, so many things are coincidence. So we have to weigh a lot of factors to see, is there a theistic context to it that tends to predominate in the cases where we have these, and so on. You need a lot of cases to be able to test that. But the issue that he raises about replicability is a real issue in the sense that when we speak of God creating everything, and we speak of, as Christians, speak of God's handiwork being all around us, those are things that can be tested for replicability, but we may disagree on the explanation, or levels of causation. But miracles as one-offs, so to speak, they're not replicable. And so they're not really testable by replicable means. You can't, ensure that you're going to have one the next time around. At the same time, there's all sorts of things we have to deal with that aren't replicable. Certainly in historiography, I have to deal with that. So when we want to know how somebody died, we can't kill them again to ensure that. And that's why I brought up how in different disciplines we have to use the epistemic approach that's suitable for that discipline. And so for miracles, I think a case study approach is much better, which is why GMRI is doing things, and actually they look for things that are medically unique, so much narrower than I would look for, but trying to then go ahead and publish those in peer-reviewed journals and so on. And
just for my benefit, Craig, why, when they do that, why do you feel sympathetic to the view that what they're finding is evidence for supernatural healing rather than just extraordinary, somewhat unexplained events? What is specific about that data that suggests it isn't just a fluke, one of those 1 in a million things that just happens sometimes?
Yeah, anomalies occur. So it's important to look for an accumulation of anomalies. So you don't just have what could be a coincidence, but a coincidental, in a massive coincidences. There's something called the Lazarus Syndrome, where I think in terms of documented cases where somebody, as far as anybody can tell, has been dead and they come back to life over an hour later, and they've found, the estimates I've seen have been like maybe 1 a year, and again, these aren't all medically documented, but in circles I know of people that I knew before I knew that they had stories like this, I've got like 10 of them in my immediate circle. So it's not just, unless we're burying a hugely inordinate proportion of people prematurely, these things actually do tend to happen in certain circles more than in others. And that's why for me, it would be hard for me to see it as a coincidence. I had my brother, whose PhD is in physics, help me calculate the probabilities of that. And he was quite, he gave me some really extraordinary probabilities on that just being a coincidence.
And to that extent, Michael, I suppose it's this point that Elijah also brought up as well. It's the context that is key. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that, unusual things happen. It's that they seem to happen more often when, at the moment, someone prays. It's in the context of a prayer that it's significant. So what's your view on that?
Well, the counterfactual. What about the Christian families who pray for their loved one who's dying from cancer and they just die? Nothing happens from the prayer. That happens all the time. Christian families of Christian soldiers coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, lost limbs and so on, they get prayed for and they're not healed. Not just loss of limbs, but all kinds of injuries. And, so why are they not healed? If the context matters and we're defining a miracle as divine intervention, not just a highly improbable event, then how come there's no divine intervention there? And if the answer is, well, God works in mysterious ways, who knows? That's kind of a hand wave. That doesn't really help us understand the phenomenon at hand.
Yeah. Elijah, go ahead.
Well, I think also calling a hand wave kind of undermines something. Is imagine you caught a murderer and you saw him shoot a guy and he goes, well, I haven't shot anyone before in my life. Is that what we're trying to show is these are real examples. I can't explain the soldier coming home. That makes perfect sense. But what I can say is there was a blind lady and she got prayer and her eyes opened up and she had macular degeneration. They can verify that before and afterwards. And I'm not sure it's rational to call those just coincidences. Like you're assuming some type of causality there. And I think if you even allow for the possibility of something like the Christian God to exist, then you've got to take seriously that it could be his action and then make an inference to the best explanation. And where I think the voice of science comes in the best is in eliminating hypotheses, not necessarily proving that's his voice. And so you can go back and go, well, there's 7 different hypotheses. Science can help us with 4, eliminating some, and then we've got 2 or 3, and we've got to critically think and go, what do I think is most likely the case? And I think that's the human situation, and we make that call all the time. We make it in court.
Yeah.
We make it so if you allow, it's possible there's a person like God exists. But if not, you've blinded yourself to the reality or the possibility of miracles. You can't be objective. You can't say, I'm an open-minded person if you can't allow for the possibility of it happening.
So you feel it's fair, once you've exhausted other possible natural explanations, to leave the God option on the table, it's okay for that to be an explanation. Obviously, some people may say, well, I'm just not willing to consider that because it's something I cannot measure by definition. It's something I cannot have a physical explanation for. But for you, that itself is a form of, well, dogmatism, because they're not willing to look at this specific way of understanding things.
Right. And you got to be skeptical of your skepticism. So if you go, I don't allow for a God to exist, then you're not open-minded. And if that's the one thing people could walk away with, is just, am I open-minded about miracles or not? But if you've pre-concluded there's no God, then you've already pre-concluded. I could show you cases of arms growing back, theoretically speaking, and you would not believe it. You would come up with natural explanations. And so,
because a naturalistic explanation would always be preferred. Well, look, we're going to go to a short break, and I'm interested to see what Michael has to say in response to all this in just a moment's time. We're talking about Miracles, the new documentary by Elijah Stephens. It's called Send Proof. We're asking, is there evidence for modern miracles? Also joining me today, Michael Shermer and Craig Keener. Have you ever found yourself tongue-tied when someone asks you, is there evidence for God? What about suffering? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? I'd like to introduce you to Confident Christianity, our online apologetics course. Featuring video training from world-renowned thinkers such as William Lane Craig, John Lennox, Amy Orr Ewing and Gary Habermas, you'll learn how to understand, defend and share your faith with confidence. I'll also share lessons I've learned from over 15 years of hosting atheists and Christians in dialogue. You can enrol now at premier.org.uk/course or click the link with this video. Welcome back to today's show. We're talking about miracles, something we actually explored just a few weeks ago on the show in slightly different context. We were debating Hume's maxim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, we're sort of treading similarish ground today, but really looking at some very specific cases. These are part of the new video documentary by Elijah Stephens called Send Proof. Craig Keener is one of the Christian theologians and scholars who he interviews for that. So is Michael Shermer, well, not a Christian one, a more skeptical one. But we've just been talking about in that last segment about whether, should we be open at least to the God explanation, a supernatural explanation, if we've ruled out other things? And that's where Elijah says, Michael, that science can be useful in helping us to at least eliminate certain explanations. And once we've eliminated possible explanations, should we not then be open to, by inference to the best explanation, to a non-scientific, in that sense, explanation, a supernatural intervention? So what's your view on that, Michael?
Yeah, I agree. We can't rule that out completely. And here I would employ something like a Bayesian reasoning approach of probabilities, and not black and white a binary where, I'm going to deny God's existence and therefore there can't be miracles by definition, then what's the point of even having a conversation about it? So, yeah, that's not helpful. There's a third position that is, I don't know. Here I'll quote the psychologist David Myers, who's a religious man, that his definition of monotheism is there is a God and I'm not him and neither are you. So none of us know what it's like to be an omniscient being and know everything. And the secular version of that is that there is objective truth, but I don't know what it is and neither do you. And so we're left in this position of fallible beings trying to understand a complex world, and we're never going to get it right. So you have to always leave open the possibilities of there's some other explanation, for sure. And so scientists can get us to the point where we've eliminated, I don't know what, say 95% of all the claims. I use that figure just because I've been writing a lot about UAPs and UFOs. And, even the hardcore UFO believers say, well, 95% of them are totally explainable. They're geese or airplanes or balloons or whatever. We're just talking about this other 5% here. This is where we think, you're going to find the aliens. Well, maybe, but maybe we're just never going to have 100% explanations. We're always going to have a residue of unexplained anomalies. And what do you do with them? And my answer is you don't have to do anything with them. You could just say, well, first of all, to the person that got healed, I'm glad, congratulations. Good for you. That's good. But if you want to drill down, but why did that happen? We may just hit a wall and just say, I don't know. And no doctor is going to say, for sure we know that this couldn't have happened, because doctors just don't know. They're not God either. So, we just have to be open to the possibility that there could be something. We just don't know what's going on there. And so that unknown is, always going to be present, and that's okay. Just to say, I don't know.
Okay, Craig, what are your thoughts on that?
First, I wanted to come back to what Michael said about non-healings, that's something we all would agree on. In fact, in a biblical worldview, it says so-and-so begot so-and-so, and then they died. It's like pretty uniform throughout biblical teaching, everybody dies. And so, again, miracles not being replicable, being one-offs, that's just, that's what we're stuck with if we're going to investigate them. I think the study that you were citing, Michael, that's the STEP study. Is that the one?
No, it was Herbert Benson at Harvard that conducted that. That might have been like early 2000s. I forget the STEP study. I think that's a different one.
Okay. All right. If I'm not mistaken, the one that Herbert Benson conducted was that when they were trying to recruit people, they were having trouble getting certain participants, that all the Protestant participants were from the Unity School of Christianity, which actually doesn't believe in miracles. And so, they had a limit. It's not the ideal way to conduct a prayer study to determine whether miracles.
Sure. You can't go to the patient's family and say, okay, no praying for your exactly. guy, because this is science. So they might have been prayed for anyway.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yeah,
and I was going to say, Craig, in relation to those kinds of studies, there's one variable you can't control for, and that is obviously God. So to what extent do you think it's even possible to do a study in which you're basically testing whether God does something or not? Is that wise? I don't know. You're
supposed to get informed consent from all the participants. And if God doesn't sign that he's going to participate. But there's also the sense, I do think, we should look for evidence. And I think that there is evidence. But I also think, when we look at the Gospels, Jesus was happy to heal people, to do things demonstrably. But then when some people said, no, we want a sign from heaven, it's like, okay, we're not going to believe unless you do it this way. And God isn't obligated to jump through our hoops. And I think that once we say replicability, again, we are beyond the nature of miracles. In terms of, there's confirmation bias, I think, that can happen either way. I think a lot of times people will see something as a miracle because we're inclined to believe in miracles. You can also have confirmation bias to say, well, I'm inclined not to see this as a miracle because I just don't think those things happen. In terms of anomalies, whether they're anomalies or whether they're explainable in some way, it helps if there's a pattern. They're not replicable, but if there's a pattern, like 9 times out of 10 where this happens, it's in the context of prayer, that should say something. Again, we need a whole lot of cases to be able to examine that. With the Bayes theorem, Thomas Bayes, I think, passed away before he was able to publish it, but Richard Price, his friend, they were both ministers and mathematicians, but Richard Price, his friend, actually published the Bayes theorem, and if I'm not mistaken, first deployed it actually to challenge Hume's probability claim regarding miracles. So I'm not an expert in Bayesian theory, and actually Michael is probably a lot stronger in it than I am, but yeah, some of those probability claims.
The idea is just to kind of try to put some numbers on it, which may or may not be applicable in one-off events like that. So then you end up evaluating the quality of the evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and who was reporting it and what their background was, and so on. And so just to bring up a bad example that for which I think all of you would agree is not an example, Peter Popoff's miraculous cures, which you can watch on TV. Which have all been debunked. James Randi famously did this with hidden cameras and microphones and so on, where you'd see Peter Popoff come up to some lady in the front row in a wheelchair and proclaim, Jesus wants you to get up out of that chair right now, and then put his hand on her head and get out demons and so on, and then the woman gets up and she starts walking. Everybody goes, oh my God, it's a miracle. But then you find out later that, in fact, that woman walked into the tent, into the church, and because she was elderly, they offered her a free wheelchair, and you can sit in the front row. She's like, okay, and they wheel her down there. So no miracle occurred at all. Or he appears to get the names and ailments and even home addresses of people sitting there in the audience. And then, as Randy discovered, Peter Popoff was wearing a little hearing device, and his wife was in the back room reading the prayer cards that everybody filled out before the session began. And so, again, no miracle, just, it's a con game. And so you guys all would go, oh, yeah, okay, that's a bunch of baloney. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so you do have standards of criteria of what's acceptable knowledge to believe. And you have standards, and you go, okay, we're going to reject, 95% of these. And then, so we're left again with this 5%. Why say, well, that one right there is we're going to count in our bin of true miracles, although we recognize most of them are not. That there, to me, it doesn't seem like there's an established set of criteria that everybody agrees, that's the criteria we're going to use.
Well, maybe you could speak to that, Elijah, and you obviously referenced that Peter Popoff story.
Sure.
In fact, you interviewed James Randi about it himself before he passed away.
Yeah.
So firstly, maybe deal with that, the fact that obviously there are many charlatans out there and so on. How does that affect the way we should weigh the evidence?
Sure.
And secondly, what do you do with those anomalies, as Craig and Michael have called them, and what makes them worth thinking they might be true as opposed to just unknowns, really?
Sure. First of all, I love James Randi. He added so much to the conversation, and I think we all benefit from that man, and he lived and helped a lot of people. And so I just want to say that. But I think the fact that there are fake miracles does not preclude the fact that there can be real miracles. And so knowledge falls on a continuum from this is impossible, very doubtful, 50-50, I don't know, probable, highly probable, 100% certain. 2 + 2 is 4. God exists. I exist. Those are the only two I know with 100% certainty. I don't put God exists with 100% certainty. And then all other truth claims, you go, I'm this confident in my belief this is true, and I will adapt if I need to. And so I don't think I don't know should be your default position unless that's really where you fall. And so what I encourage people to do is read all sides, make an inference to the best explanation, and go, this is what I think is most likely the case. Secondly, we're talking about these things objectively. Put yourself in situations where you can have experiential knowledge. Pray for sick people that you know they would not be healed unless God showed up. And if there's one thing I hope this film does for people that are inside of the Christian faith, is that it makes them confident enough to go pray for sick people in impossible situations, because that is a means to knowledge as well. This is the thing. We're debating these things as armchair observers. Granted, that's a part of it, but I also think there's this existential element that gets lost in this conversation, that you can gain knowledge through doing.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, because in some ways the people you're interviewing a lot of the time are not philosophers or theologians. They're people who are going and doing stuff and say they're seeing extraordinary things. I mean, one of the most famous is Heidi Baker, who for a long time has had a ministry in Mozambique, and on the face of it appears to see regularly, all the time, extraordinary things happen. People who are blind being able to see, people who were deaf being able to hear. And I think researchers have gone out and seen extraordinary things happen in front of their eyes and been able to test their auditory responses and so on. So for you, Elijah, just describe some of that and why you think that doesn't just fall into the 1 in a million, it just happened to be the right day for that person to get their sight back or receive their hearing.
Well, there's known impossibilities. I know I can't jump to the sun. And so there are things we know that cannot happen. I think that's a part of the conversation. I also think we in the West have a bias toward poor people as not having knowledge of when something's dead or, an arm is broken or something of that nature. And so I think when people put themselves in situations where they pray for the sick and a whole village knows this child was born blind from birth, and they're 15 years old, and that person gets their sight back, and this is a different religion, and that village testifies he was blind, now he sees. That is a different scenario than we're talking about here. And the lens of science really can't speak to that. But if you're that kid, you've got to go, what's more probable, that an event that just randomly happened, or the God that I was praying to gave me my sight back? And so that is a part of the conversation. I think we as armchair academics, I don't want to use that phrase, that's pejorative, but people sitting back and watching kind of don't take into account. Like, this is life-changing stuff that's happening to these people.
Michael, before Craig comes back on that, I mean, would you be interested in going on a fact-finding kind of expedition where these sorts of things are claimed to happen, often in remote areas where, medical evidence is very hard to come by for these sorts of things, but where on a regular basis people say extraordinary things are happening? Is that something, would you be thrilled to find that there genuinely were outstanding evidences for people being healed in this way?
Well, hopefully some of this happens in Southern California, so I don't have to go too far to see it. If I want to go to a malaria-infested third world country to have to witness this, presumably Christians in America can make this happen. There are cases of blindness, like psychological blindness due to trauma in war, for example, where it does come back, and no one really understands why it was not there in the first place. Because the apparatus is working, the person reports they can't see. There's nothing wrong with their rods and cones and that sort of thing, and then all of a sudden they can see again. There are cases of that are not considered miraculous. It's more related to PTSD and things like that. What would really impress me, I think, would be the growing a limb thing. I think, Elijah, did you say you've actually seen this or documented it?
No.
Or
I
you've
said
heard?
theoretically.
Oh.
I have not seen
theoretically,
that.
yeah, that
So
would impress me because that we know humans can't do. Salamanders could do it.
Mm-hmm.
They can grow back a limb. Certain lizards, their tail falls off and they grow it back. And so why can't humans do that? Well, it's not in our DNA to do that. So if that happened, let's say a war veteran from Afghanistan comes back and he's missing a leg, and his Christian family prays for him, and the leg grows back, and we could, presumably this would happen in over some period of time. It's not like the leg is just going to pop in there in a millisecond. So, if you documented that, like here's a video of this leg growing back, like a time lapse video, like you'd see a salamander growing back a limb, that would do it for me. I'd say that would be...
What would it do for you, though?
Extraordinary.
I'm interested in this, Michael, because I wanted to ask you this very question, which is, what would the bar be? Where would the level of evidence need to be for you that this was... I mean, would it convince you that something really bizarre had happened, or would it convince you that God has healed this person? What would it be?
Both, and I would entertain that hypothesis more than I would have before.
Okay.
The second one, the God did it. Yeah, that would do it.
It would bring you a lot closer to believing there might be something in this whole God thing than before. Okay. Well, Craig, there is a website out there called Why Won't God Heal Amputees, and at one level it would be great, wouldn't it? I mean, Elijah, that would have been the one thing he needed in his documentary to kind of seal the deal. Video evidence of a limb growing back. Why, given the fact that we have a proliferation of cameras, video devices, and everything in the century we live in, why are those kinds of very obvious, extraordinary cases of healing not yet documented? I don't know if there are cases you've heard of, perhaps, where such things have been reported, but as far as I'm aware, we've never seen any video documentary evidence of something quite that spectacular, have we?
Not one that wasn't doctored. But in terms of some of the other things like macular degeneration, undegenerating, when it's, I mean, we do have cases like that are medically documented. We have the before and after. There was one published in a medical journal within recent years. I think Elijah alluded to that. There are a number of other cases. The one that, in terms of something growing back, I mean, that's, I think the case of Bruce Van Natta is a case in point, because the small intestine doesn't grow longer in an adult. It can grow wider, but not longer. He only had, it was estimated, 25 centimeters left of his ileum, which is normally 350 centimeters. That's why he was starving. He felt a shock when his friend laid hands on him and prayed for him. I read the note from his doctor that said that his small intestine had more than doubled in length. I mean, we can't prove it happened exactly at that moment, but the next time they tested him, his small intestine had more than doubled in length. Admittedly, if you actually want to measure it, you'd have to cut him open and unroll it, which it's kind of counter to the point of the miracle in the first place, because you'd kill him. But but then we also have with that the gastroparesis healing with Chris Gunderson, which did make it into a medical journal. So that, I mean, that was. I interviewed Chris about this, and it happened when Bruce prayed for him. He also felt an electric shock for the 8 or 10 minutes that Bruce was praying. Immediately after that, he was able to eat. So, I mean, it is something growing back. It's not as visible as is like an arm or leg growing back. I don't know that we have a lot of this in the Bible. We have things like what they call withered hand becoming unwithered. But I have interviewed some people about, who've said they've seen things grow back, but I have not haven't seen any video.
Yeah, that would be good.
We do have,
maybe to use another example of what happens when you look into a story in a little more detail, like that of Ibn Alexander, the Harvard-trained neurologist who wrote that book, Proof of Heaven. He went to heaven. Well, when did he go to heaven? Well, when he was in a coma. Oh, he was in a coma. Okay. Why was he in a coma? Well, because he had this brain disease, this viral infection, I should say, that caused his brain to swell. So they put him in an induced coma so they could give him drugs and relieve the swelling of his brain and so on. And this is when this happened, but not just any time. It turns out when somebody finally got to, I think it was Oliver Sacks, in fact, that looked into this for one of his later, I think, Atlantic columns on these kind of medical miracles, that the physician that Eben Alexander she had put him in this induced coma, said, oh, no. He had that experience when we were bringing him out of the coma. And she said, this often happens when you're in this kind of gray area between being unconscious and conscious. You get these kind of hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations where you have all kinds of just kind of weird ideas that pop into your head, these weird experiences, almost hallucinogenic experiences that happens in that kind of borderlands area. And she said that's when it happened for him. So, and, when you read those kinds of accounts, to me, they're indistinguishable from, brain chemistry kind of experiences of taking hallucinogens like LSD and others that produce those through chemistry. So how can we tell the difference between, something that was probably the result of, this induced coma and so on and being brought out, that is not that unusual, and his claim that, not only did he was dead, he claims in his book, I was dead. Brain dead. Well, his doctor says, no, he wasn't brain dead. We induced his coma and his brain was, it was quiet because we had shut it down basically, but he was still alive. He didn't come back from the dead. So again, when you look into the story behind the book and you go, oh, okay, this is probably not a miracle. And
obviously, is it your view that a story like Craig has just outlined, Bruce Van Natter and the one with Chris Gunderson, if you were to look into it, you'd probably find it's not quite as simple as it appears at first glance?
Well, that'd be my guess, yes. But, I don't want to say for sure because I don't know. But I guess any kind of disease where...
Well, I think Craig wanted to come back on that.
Like it couldn't happen. Like okay, go ahead, sure.
So I think you just want to come back on that, Craig, don't you?
Yeah, this isn't a case of like somebody thought they were dead and they actually weren't in terms of these are cases where actually, the one with Chris Gunderson, the evidence was all there before and after. It's in the medical journal. In the case of with Heidi Baker and Mozambique, of course, there was a team that went. They published the report in Southern Medical Journal, September of 2010. The backlash, as you can imagine, was pretty strong, like people saying, well, the testing conditions in rural Mozambique aren't that good. That's true. But then one of the authors of the study, Candy Gunther Brown, in her book Testing Prayer, published by Harvard University Press in 2012, she has a chapter on that study. She was there, and it wasn't like, just one person, maybe it was psychosomatic, or something else that they couldn't see, but it was a number of people went from blindness to seeing, from deafness to hearing. Now, Heidi's husband invited me to actually come to Mozambique and be there while some of this stuff was happening, and I didn't do it because I had other commitments. But I have other friends, PhDs, who have been there on different occasions, and these things are happening in non-Christian villages. So, the people don't have any reason to make this stuff up, or let's try to fool the Christians, because they end up starting a church the next day. And many of these people have actually had to go on and die for their new faith in Christ. They've been persecuted for it. So, again, according to standards we'd use in historiography, this is something that should really get our attention.
Elijah, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think the purpose of being a knower is to know as many true things as we can and believe as many false. And so when it comes to these counter examples to miracles. You need them because you can go, all right, there are cases where maybe the brain best explains this near-death experience. There's also the Journal of Evidential Near-Death Experiences where people say, all right, I can give some type of evidence. I was able to read a barcode or something of that. And so what we have to do as knowers, and I hope our audience takes this away, is make inferences to the best explanations about the cases we're studying, not counter cases. Like, think about the case you're looking at critically and go, these are the 4 or 5 hypotheses that can happen. I can eliminate 3 or 4. This is what I think's most probable. Here's why. And so it's good. We need that voice saying, hey, here's ones where it blurs, and you got to critically think about that to apply to these other cases, but look at each case individualistically. To outright dismiss it is to be intellectually dishonest at some level, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll come back to Michael in just a moment. We're going to go to our final break and we'll have a chance to wrap up this conversation on miracles, modern miracle healing claims. That's the subject of the new documentary Send Proof by Elijah Stephens. Joining us also on the show today, Craig Keener and Michael Shermer.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
Welcome back to the final part of this week's discussion. Send Proof. Is there evidence for modern miracles? Michael Shermer, Craig Keener and Elijah Stephens join me. If you want to get hold of the documentary yourself, go to sendproof.com. There's a link with today's show. Michael Shermer can be found at michaelshermer.com and Craig Keener at craigkeener.com. I love it when websites are so simple because it's just the name of the person or the documentary.com. Michael, before we start to wrap up today's show, okay, give us some sense of these stories we've been hearing, the kind of specific examples that might give you pause. I mean, you've mentioned obviously a limb growing back. Well, we don't have documentary evidence of that, but we've heard about immacular degeneration.
Why does God seem to heal the things that could possibly heal on their own anyway? Why not pick something that's unmistakable, like growing back a limb? Well, maybe God works in mysterious ways, or he doesn't want us to know for sure because it takes a leap of faith or something like that. So, but again, back to science, we have to have some kind of objective criteria. So if it was immaculate degeneration, I don't know enough about it to know that it never, ever reverses. I'm told there's no treatment for it. It just continues on until you're blind. Okay. That would be impressive if that was the case. But let me just tell you one little story about the limitations of medical science. And when doctors say this could never, ever happen. So in 1990, my mom had got a brain tumor, a meningioma brain tumor. And so we had it retracted, and then 2 more grew in. So we had surgeries on those, and then 4 grew in. And this thing went on for 10 years. And then all of a sudden she gets a few tumors in her lungs. And so we're like, okay, come on, this must have migrated from her brain. And the doctors, these were like the top oncologists at USC Medical Center. And they're telling us, no, that is not possible. That has never happened. It isn't possible for the cells from the brain to migrate from this kind of tumor, this meningioma brain tumor, to migrate down into the lungs. And I'm like, oh, okay, then it must be just lung cancer. It's just bad luck. Anyway, that same night, I was at a dinner party at Carol Tavris's house, the great social psychologist, and her friend Avram Blooming, who's an oncologist, and was an early pioneer in making medical documents available online for free. So he was steeped in medical literature, and I'm telling him this story that I just told you, and he says, you know what? I think there was a paper published 6 months ago showing that meningioma brain tumors can migrate out of the brain in other parts of the body. So sure enough, he sends me the link. I get the paper. I give it to this oncologist at USC Medical Center. They're like, whoa, wow, we had no idea. It's like, you had no idea. It took me, a non-medical person, going to a dinner party and mentioning this story to find out and tell this guy. Again, they're not gods. They can only read so much, and there's just new stuff comes up. And so the idea of medical doctors say this could never happen. Well, they're not gods. They don't know that.
Okay, well, interesting. Craig, do you want to comment on that? And specifically, I suppose, the first objection Michael had, which is why doesn't God do things that couldn't potentially be curing themselves in the course of time? So many miracle healing claims are things that could be explained by remission or natural causes, even if they happen to occur at a time when someone prays or whatever it might be. Why not these indisputable claims? Do you have a theological reason why God may not give those kind of bulletproof examples of healing?
I don't have a theological reason why limbs wouldn't grow back, and I'm not saying that God never does that. I mean, I've read reports where people have claimed that, eyewitnesses, but I just have no way to investigate those. They're too far away. One case, actually a couple cases where I actually interviewed the people, but again, it's so far out of my realm of experience that, like we talk about burden of proof in epistemology, I'd want to, I guess I'd want to see some medical records for that as well. But we do have other cases like the macular degeneration, the auditory nerve damage, and plenty of people that I've talked with have witnessed visible lumps instantly disappearing, and so on. Some of them are visible. You mentioned earlier about things caught on video. Again, people can fake videos, but there's one case where she was paralyzed for 22 years, and she was a gospel singer, so all sorts of videos all over the place of her singing from her wheelchair. She had no feeling in her legs, and suddenly, one time she was in a meeting where people were being prayed for. She wasn't prayed for herself, she was praying for somebody else. Suddenly feeling came to her legs. They helped her to walk around, but she couldn't support her own weight. Her muscles were still atrophied, but she was moving her hips under her own power. And after we do have some cases where the muscles weren't even atrophied. But normally when God does it, at least from our Christian perspective, when God heals somebody, their muscles are still atrophied, so she still had to work at it. But within a month, she was walking normally, and this was after 22 years of being paralyzed. So there are things that are sometimes caught on video. There are things that one was caught on video, and there are things where we do have before and after medical documentation, which is really what GMRI, I think, is where it needs to go, because my historiographic epistemology can only carry things so far, and for people like Michael, we do need more of these. We have some of them, but we definitely need more of these research claims where there are before and after medical documentation.
I suppose the tricky thing always, Michael, is going to be at what point you genuinely have something that raises to that particular bar, and isn't just kind of in the, well, that's mysterious, but I'm not prepared to attribute a supernatural cause to that over something that science just hasn't yet explained, I suppose.
Right. So back to, if you already believe in God, then this is perhaps additional reasons to believe. You've got the foundation there. If you don't, then that just goes into the bin of, who knows? Just there's a lot of mysteries we just don't know. So it could come down to something like that, to what you already believe. And something like growing a limb back into the context of prayer, that would tilt this, that would be the slam dunk, the home run, the, make it real. That appears to be off the table. Well, okay. Darn, why isn't it really clear? I mean, I have nothing against believing in a God. There might be a God. I don't know. I'm kind of ontologically agnostic on that, in the sense that it's not knowable ultimately, although I act like I'm an atheist and I just assume there isn't a God for the time being. But I'm happy to wake up when my time comes in some other realm. I'm in the quantum field that Deepak Chopra thinks is heaven, or I'm in the Christian heaven. Hopefully that'll be a good place to be, and so on. I have nothing against it, but the question is it true or not? And well, yeah, that's the point of this discussion.
At this point, you remain unconvinced. Elijah, perhaps we'll finish with you as we round out today's show. Obviously, in the course of that documentary, you were talking to skeptics and Christians, people who claimed miracles, people who had been disappointed as well. You mentioned this pastor friend of yours who features near the beginning of the documentary, who became an atheist because he was in a charismatic denomination, but he wasn't seeing the miracles he was told he should see. And a lot of the time, our experiences actually are about disappointment in the way that Michael explains. The only reason miracles are what they are, miracles, is because they are quite rare, actually, even though you've tracked down some pretty extraordinary claims of miracles. So how do you balance all of that, the fact that in the normal course of things, this is quite unusual, and many Christians who would love to see something that confirms their faith in that way, but many times don't. Is that, I suppose, the point of what you're doing, GMRI, to say, okay, but it does happen and here's some proof?
Yes, at some level, I hope that Christians watch this and pray for the sick, that we get past our fear and that we record if and when God does something, and that we're intellectually honest about it in the process. But there are a lot of, at least from my perspective, there are a lot of people not healed because Christians don't live the teachings of Jesus.
So if you don't pray in the first place, then you're very unlikely to see anyone get healed.
Sure.
If you don't, try it out. It's a bit like the people who say, I never play the lottery because I know I won't win. Well, how do you know you won't win unless you've tried playing it? Yeah. Interesting stuff. Thank you so much, and such an interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed all of this that we've had today between you, Craig, Elijah, and Michael today. If you want, again, the documentary itself, sendproof.com. I found it fascinating, very well produced. Whether or not you come away convinced, I think you'll find it a worthwhile watch. michaelshermer.com and craigkeener.com for Craig and Michael's sites. But for now, thank you all for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
All right.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.